Okay, so I got the outline up here. We've gone through the first 7 chapters. We spent a lot of time in 6 and 7, but that's okay because those are really the high point of the book. And as I've told you, 2 Samuel 7 is possibly the most important chapter in the Old Testament in terms of understanding Jesus and who people thought Jesus was and what he was doing. So we really have, in a lot of ways, we've reached the climax of the book. These next few chapters are kind of the afterglow of the climax. We'll go through them, but I'm not gonna. We'll go through them swiftly, not because they're not important, but they're just kind of basically David is, like everything is great, and he's it's a kind of finishing off the narrative of David's rise, and then we had a pause for the ark coming to Jerusalem in chapter 6, and then the covenant, and we're just kind of finishing off that like this movement of David expanding, consolidating the kingdom. Okay, and these chapters are pretty short. Then at the end of chapter 10, that's the hinge point of the book in terms of where things start to go south, and it gets really bad really fast. So we'll get there tonight as well. Okay, so we're in chapter 8, David's wars. And remember, 6 and 7, as I said, were kind of a pause in the action. We're really just continuing this kind of campaign against the neighbors. And what he's going to do is he's going to subjugate the people. He's going to defeat and make vassal states of their neighbors to the north, south, east, and west. Okay. After this, David defeated the Philistines and subdued them. And David took Meth-Eg-Ammon out of the hands of the Philistines. So the Philistines are down here, okay. And he defeated Moab and measured them with a line, making them lie down on the ground. 2 lines he measured to be put to death, and 1 full line to be spared. And the Moabites became servants to David and brought tribute. So Moab is down here, okay. David also defeated Hadadzer, the son of Rehob, king of Zobah, and he went to restore his power at the river Euphrates. So that would be up there, okay, in the north. And David took from him 1,700 horsemen and 20,000 foot soldiers. And David hamstrung all the chariot horses, but left enough for 100 chariots. And when the Syrians of Damascus came to help Hadadzer, I don't know some of these names are Hadadezer, king of Zobah, David slew 22,000 men of the Syrians. So the Syrians would be far north, okay. Then David put garrisons in Aram of Damascus, and the Syrians became servants to David and brought tribute. Notice too, when you make your neighbors vassal states, not only do you give, you secure the borders of the empire, but also the tribute that comes in. So what's increasing also? Wealth, right? Okay. It's not necessarily that the Israelites are going to occupy these areas. They've already got their land, right? But you got vassals, they're going to pay you tribute. So, and the Lord gave victory to David wherever he went. Notice who gets the credit ultimately? The Lord. It's David doing this, yes, but it's first and foremost, it's the Lord doing it. And those two things are not contradictory, right? David does it, yes. The Lord does it, yes. Okay. And David took the shields of gold, which were carried by the servants of Hadadezer, and brought them to Jerusalem. And from Betah and from Berothai, cities of Hadadezer, David took very much bronze. When Tui, king of Hamath, heard that David had defeated the whole army of Hadadezer, Tui sent his son Joram to King David to greet him and to congratulate him because he had fought against Hadadezer and defeated him. For Hadadezer had often been at war with Toi. And Joram brought with him articles of silver, of gold, and of bronze. These also King David dedicated to the Lord, together with the silver and the gold which he dedicated from all the nations he subdued. Important to point out here, is David attached to the riches of the wealth? No, because he's giving it to the Lord, right? He's not warmongering for the sake of riches, right? He's getting wealthier, the kingdom's getting wealthier, but he's giving it back to the Lord, right? So that's an important, point too. From Edom, Moab, the Ammonites. So the Ammonites are over here to the east, okay? The Philistines, Amalek, which is, we talked about them, right? The Amalekites, they're down here. Okay. And from the spoil of Hadadezer, the son of Rehob, king of Zobah. And David won a name for himself. When he returned, he slew 18,000 Edomites in the Valley of Salt. The Valley of Salt. So here's Edom. The Edomites, does anybody know who the Edomites are descendant of? Esau. Yeah, so you have Jacob and Esau. So the Edomites are down here, okay? This is the Dead Sea, so Valley of Salt, Dead Sea. Right? And he put garrisons in Edom. Throughout all Edom, he put garrisons, and all the Edomites became David's servants. And the Lord gave victory to David wherever he went. So notice, we've covered the entire map, right? He's not only secured land for his people, but he's also subdued and made vassal states of all of his immediate neighbors, and they're all on this particular map. That's part of why they're on this map. Okay. So David reigned over all Israel, and David administered justice and equity to all his people. And Joab, the son of Zeruiah, remember this is David's nephew, okay, Joab, was over the army. And Jehoshaphat, the son of Ahilud, was recorder. And Zadok, the son of Ahitub, and Amalek, the son of Abiathar, were priests. And Zeruiah was secretary. And Benaniah, the son of Jehoiada, was over the Cherethites and the Pelethites. And David's sons were priests. The Cherethites and the Pelethites are mercenaries, so they're people that he hired to help with these conquests. And it's not strange that David's sons are called priests, because you have to remember, like, the religious structure and the administrative structure are very much intertwined, right? Also, it's also a statement about David as, the priest king, right? He's the king. He's in the line of the order of Melchizedek. Okay, so like I said, everything's great, right? I mean, that statement, David reigned over all Israel and administered justice and equity to all his people. There's a very Adamic statement, right? Like, that's what Adam was supposed to do in the garden, right? On behalf of God, rule the garden with justice and equity. It's basically a blanket statement saying, like, it's all great. This is God's kingdom, right? That's what David is administering. All right, then we have a little interlude here in chapter 9. David's kindness to Mephibosheth. This is a hard name to say too, Mephibosheth. And David said, Is there still anyone left of the house of Saul, that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake? Because remember, we kind of talked about this a little bit, but some of this was in 1 Samuel. David had swore, it's not just that David wants to be kind, but he swore an oath to Jonathan that I will take care of your family, right? And now that he's like, he's everything, we've got some security. Now he's kind of like, yeah, like, where is there anybody around? Now there was a servant of the house of Saul, whose name was Ziba, and they called him to David. And the king said to him, Are you Ziba? And he said, Your servant is he. And the king said, Is there not still someone of the house of Saul, that I may show the kindness of God to him? Ziba said to the king, There is still a son of Jonathan. He is crippled in his feet. You remember the story? There's that little story we heard that was an interlude. That's why this story, because we know how Mephibosheth was crippled. They were fleeing. He was a child. His nurse dropped him. He's been crippled ever since. Okay. The king said to him, Where is he? And Ziba said to the king, He is in the house of Machir, the son of Amiel, at Lodebar. Then David sent and brought him from the house of Machir, the son of Amiel, at Lodebar. And Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, son of Saul, came to David and fell on his face and did obeisance. So, obviously he's wondering, what's he going to do to me, right? I mean, my family was his rival family, okay? And David said to him, Do not fear, for I will show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan, and I will restore to you all the land of Saul your father, and you shall eat at my table always. And he did obeisance and said, What is your servant that you should look upon a dead dog such as I? So, obviously, there could be a more cynical or politically shrewd reading too. I mean, obviously David wants to keep tabs on this guy, right? But he is also showing him kindness, and he's not only saying, to say that you can eat at my table is to say I'm going to treat you as one of my sons, right? So he's going above and beyond, and he's also restoring the lands of his father, right? The family lands, okay, not the kingship, obviously, but right. Verse 9. Then the king said to Ziba, Saul's servant, and said to him, all that belonged to Saul and to all his house I have given to your master's son, and you and your sons and your servants shall till the land for him, shall bring in the produce, that your master's son may have bread to eat. But Mephibosheth, your master's son, shall always eat at my table. Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Then Ziba said to the king, according to all that my lord commands his servant, so will your servant do. Basically what Ziba has been doing, he was a servant of Saul's house, and the land of Saul is like up in this area, okay? I believe that's the land that they're talking about. And he's basically been running the estate. And David's saying, hey, like the master of the estate is now Mephibosheth. It's his, but I want you to still be the stewards of it, but it belongs to him, right? You need to give him the fruits of the income, right, that comes from the land and that kind of stuff. So Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of the king's sons. And Mephibosheth had a young son whose name was Micah. And all who dwelled in Ziba's house became Mephibosheth's servants. So Mephibosheth dwelt in Jerusalem, for he ate always at the king's table. Now he was lame in both his feet. So, yeah, probably not a threat. Like I said, there's also probably a political shrewdness here, right? Like keep him close by, just so he doesn't, But he does go above and beyond, because he's to treat him as a son. Okay, all right, we'll keep on going. Okay, now we get to the chapter 10. Oh, and I put here, two things can be true at the same time, right? He's extending kindness to this guy. He also probably wants to keep a close eye on him. Like both those things can be true. It doesn't have to be either or. Okay, chapter 10. The Ammonites and Syrians are defeated. So the Ammon is here, okay? And Rabbath is the capital of Ammon. So they're on the eastern border of Israel. And then the Syrians are up here, okay? Which is where modern day Syria is, But yeah, the Syrians are up there. So we're going to get into the battle of that. And then that's going to give us the kind of backdrop to chapter 11, okay? So chapter 10, after this, the king of the Ammonites died, and Hanun, his son, reigned in his stead. And David said, I will deal loyally with Hanun, the son of Nahash, as his father dealt loyally with me. So obviously we're talking about, kingly politics here. Like he was good to me. Okay. So David sent by his servants to console him concerning his father. And David's servants came into the land of the Ammonites. But the princes of the Ammonites said to Hanun, their lord, do you think because David has sent comforters to you that he is honoring your father? Has not David sent his servants to you to search the city, to spy it out, and to overthrow it? Obviously, in this time, they had fortresses, right, and cities and walls and stuff. Well, all these cities and all these walls, they all have weaknesses, right? And it'd be very helpful, right, to check out the inside of the city to find out where would be weaknesses in this city. Remember, how did David conquer Jerusalem from the Jebusites, right? They went through a water passage, right? Basically a well that came up in the city. So the Ammonites, they aren't like they're not overly paranoid, right? Like this could be the case, right? If he's trying to send spies essentially under the guise of goodwill. Verse 4. So Hanun took David's servants, shaved off half the beard of each, and cut off their garments in the middle at their hips, and sent them away. So they cut off half their beards, and I mean, how ridiculous they would have looked, and took half their garments from the waist down, and they, shames them. Okay, in Israel time, for a man to have his beard shaved, you only did that in Israel in this time, in times of mourning, right? It's considered a great insult to shave or remember the suffering servant, right? I gave my face to those who plucked my beard, right? That would be a great insult to someone to shave their or pluck their beard. So they're humiliating these guys. They're treating them like prisoners of war, right? And make and treating them shamefully. When it was told David, he sent to meet them, for the men were greatly ashamed. And the king said, remain at Jericho until your beards have grown, and then return. So here we are in Ammon. Presumably they went to Rabbath, the capital. Okay. Like I said, this is so shameful that David's like, it's okay. I don't need to see you, right? You just stay in Jerusalem and recover until your beards grow back, right? So there's Jericho right there. Okay, this is where Israel entered the Holy Land originally. Okay, with under Joshua. When the Ammonites, verse 6, when the Ammonites saw that they had become odious to David, the Ammonites sent and hired the Syrians at Beth Rahob and the Syrians of Zobah, 20,000 foot soldiers, and the king of Ma'akah with 1,000 men, and the men of Tob, 12,000 men. So these are peoples from the north of Ammon, okay? And they're asking, like, hey, we ticked off David. And David's pretty powerful at this point, right? Like, hey, we're going to need your help, okay? So we're kind of getting the backstory of like how this little battle in this war started. Verse 7, and when David heard of it, he sent Joab and all the hosts of the mighty men. And the Ammonites came out and drew up in battle array at the entrance of the gate. And the Syrians of Zobah and Rehob and the men of Tob and Ma'akah were by themselves in the open country. So it's kind of painting this picture, right? You've got some of them in the country. All right. Some of them are in the country, right? Some of them are in the city. Okay, the Ammonites are in the city, and their allies are in the field, okay, surrounding the city. When Joab saw that the battle was set against him both in front and in the rear, he chose some of the picked men of Israel and arrayed them against the Syrians, the ones who are in the field. Okay, and the rest of his men he put in charge of Abishai, his brother, and he arrayed them against the Ammonites. So he splits his force into, there's going to be a force against the Ammonites in the city and a force against the Syrians and friends in the field. Okay. And he said, if the Syrians are too strong for me, then you shall help me. But if the Ammonites are too strong for you, then I will come and help you. Be of good courage, and let us play the man for our people, for the cities of our God, and may the Lord do what seems good to him. So Joab and the people who were with him drew near to battle against the Syrians, and they fled before him. So Joab gives half to his brother, half to him. Joab takes the guys into the field against the Syrians. He gives his brother to the city, and Joab, we don't have detailed battle plans, but just like the great generals of history, Hannibal and Napoleon, and they're genius. Like Joab seems to be a military genius, and that and that's probably partly why David kept him around, because here he splits up his force, and Joab takes half of it, and he takes care of the Assyrians, and then they're able to go help the city, and no problem. We split our forces and we defeated all these guys who had allied against us, right? Not least, probably due to the military genius of Joab, right? He's pretty smart, right, general. And when the Ammonites saw that the Syrians fled, they likewise fled before Abishai and entered the city. So I guess they had come out of the city. Now they're scared. They're going back into the city. Okay. Then Joab returned from fighting against the Ammonites and came to Jerusalem. But when the Syrians saw that they had been defeated by Israel, they gathered themselves together. And Hadadezer sent and brought out the Syrians who were beyond the Euphrates, and they came to Halam, with Shobach, the commander of the army of Hadadezer, at their head. And when it was told David had gathered all Israel together and crossed the Jordan and came to Halam, and the Syrians arrayed themselves against David and fought with him. And the Syrians fled before Israel, and David slew of the Syrians the men of 700 chariots and 40,000 horsemen, and wounded Shobach, the commander of their army, so that he died there. When all the kings who were servants of Hadadezer saw that they had been defeated by Israel, they made peace with Israel and became subject to them. So the Syrians feared to help the Ammonites anymore. So basically, what's the whole point of this chapter? The Ammonites, tick off David by, not being very kind to his emissaries. The Ammonites get help from the Syrians who are in the far north and even beyond the Euphrates, right? They come. Joab's brilliance pushes them back. And then the Syrians regroup, and they bring even more soldiers. And then David himself crosses the Jordan, and somewhere in this area, kind of south and east of the Sea of Galilee, David has a definitive battle with the Syrians, pushes them back, and from that day on, the Syrians are never a threat anymore, and they don't help the Ammonites. Okay, so that's kind of there's a story, right? And again, like notice, up to this point through chapter 10, everything's very triumphant, right? David is basically undefeated. Okay, and this is but we're in this is the background of, now we're going to kind of zoom in back to David's personal life, right? Okay, Rabbah still has not been taken. Okay, they're still at war with the Ammonites, and that's the background of the next story. What we're going to get into. So yeah, 8, 9, and 10. I mean, I'm not saying they're not important, but you get it, right? David's just continuing to go from victory to victory. Okay, now though, right? Now it's going to go all downhill. Okay, it's not good. All right, so let's get to chapter 11. Famous chapter, famous story. All right. Okay. Chapter 11, verse 1. In the spring of the year, the time when kings go forth to battle, David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah. But David remained in Jerusalem. Okay, so what's going on here, right? Well, between after the winter rains, okay, and before the harvest season, you have extra farmers. You have farmers who can serve as soldiers, right? A militia. So what the verse is commenting on is that, it was in this time period, once the winter rains are gone, then you can go out on military campaign. You have to do that because you have to secure your borders, right? You have to, all of your people who are on the edges of your borders, they're right next to potential enemies, right? So if hot spots come up, it's your duty, as the king, to go and to secure, your people's safety. Well, right now, based on what we just heard in chapter 10, right, Ammon is causing problems, right? And so, but what does the verse say, right? It says, when kings go forth into battle, what does David do? He sends Joab. He doesn't go himself. Now, there could be some reasons for this, right? Maybe he's probably old. I mean, he is older now in the narrative. We don't really know exactly how many years. There's one commentator I saw that estimated he's probably about 50 when this story goes down, right? So he's not as young as he was at the beginning of his reign. So maybe he's getting a little more tired, right? Maybe he's not as willing to go out in battle. But the bottom line is he's, again, especially reading him as a Adam figure, his job is to guard and protect the garden. And he's not doing that. He's not doing his kingly duty, okay? Especially, well, we'll get to that in a second. So, and the interesting thing with this story, right, is Chronicles actually leaves this whole episode out with Bathsheba. Because if you were writing a story of your hero, right, and it's not that Chronicles is ignoring David's faults, it's just not focusing on that, right? It's kind of more of a triumphant, God's kingdom, right? But this is important. This episode important of David's fall from grace is important because David is not like the other kings of this time and area, and that he's clearly not above divine law, right? He is subject to God's law. And that wasn't the case necessarily in the ancient Near East. The king was a demigod at the least, right? He's above the law. But here we see, right, David has to answer to God, and he does, right? And I think that part of what's most devastating about what we're about to see is we've seen David is a hero, he is a good man, but he has, major lapse is not even right. It's he does some really wicked things, and why? I think that this is something important. When we're kids, when we read the story of David and Goliath. We don't read the story of David and Bathsheba, right? Because, well, although in VeggieTales they did have a episode called King George and the Rubber Ducky, yeah, which is, I don't know. women are duckies in this analogy, but we won't go there. But like they teach the story, they teach the lesson, I guess. Don't don't be selfish. Anyway, but it's simplistic, right? It's not true to the text, and it's not true to what God is trying to teach us. Of like David's just unquestioned hero. He's not actually. He's very deeply flawed. Why? Well, because so are we, right? All of us. Like, why does David sin, right? Well, because he's affected by original sin, just like all of us. And and again, what we're going to see is an Adamic fall, right? Like this is the story, and I'll point this out, is like set up to show like how, yeah, David is the new Adam who falls again in the new garden, right? And I do, and this story is famous partly because like it's not a lot of verses, but it's like Shakespearean level tragedy, right? Like that's part of the devastating part of it. David's not just a wicked king going from one wicked deed to another. He's the best king, and he does something really terrible. A few things really terrible. Okay. The other thing too to point out before we get deeper into this is David's also very secretive and very passive in a way. Like he's in his castle, he's in his palace, sending others to do his dirty work and do his bidding, right? That's not really the David that we've seen up to this point. He's a man of action. He's out there. He's with his men. He's running around, right? And again, as the verse 1 points out, he sends Joab to go do the fighting. So again, like what I think that, like, yeah, maybe part of the explanation is he is older. He's not as willing to go into battle. But I'd say, like, most commentators say, like, here we have a great example of sloth, right? David has become lazy, slothful, not diligent about doing his job to protect and guard the garden, right? That's what sets him up for the fall, right? Is sloth. Sloth is the deadly sin, right? That leads to more sin. There's the saying, right? Idleness, idle hands are the devil's workshop, right? That's exactly what's going on here, right? Another way to put it, Bishop Barron points this out, like David has lost sight of his mission, right? He doesn't have the zeal and the singular focus on God and God's mission for him like he had. And he's spirit, and we're gonna see in the next verse here before I read it. He's slumbering in the afternoon. Sleep in the scriptures is oftentimes, not always, but sometimes a metaphor for like a lack of spiritual and moral alertness. So think about like the apostles in the garden with Jesus, right? They're asleep, and Jesus is like, you guys aren't alert and watchful, and you need to be, right? Well, David, we're gonna see he's having an afternoon nap. And it's like he's not on his guard, right? He's not personally, but also for his kingdom. So again, sloth is one of the 7 deadly sins, and it's uniquely deadly in that it's the sin of, like, I'm not doing what I need to be doing, and by the way, sloth is not just spiritual, not just laziness. It's specifically like spiritual laziness. So the best definition of sloth I've ever heard is indifference to spiritual things. Not putting my priorities in order. It's not that can manifest as laziness, but you can have someone who's really, really busy, but they're also slothful because they don't take care of their spiritual life. They don't worship God. They don't pray, right? It's like, I'm busy all the time. Yeah, you're indifferent to the things that matter, and that's sloth, right? Okay. Yeah. So anyway, now with that said, though, even in this episode and in what follows, and really the rest of the book, it goes from bad to worse. Even in this, God brings good out of evil. God does not will David's evil choices, but he does bring good out of evil. Why? Well, in part, or mainly, because these events are what will lead to the birth and then eventually pave the way for the succession of Solomon, who is David's heir and successor, and the one who carries forward the covenant. So again, while David is a man after God's heart, and God certainly does not, ordain or approve of his evil actions, even here we see how God's purposes are not thwarted, right? God still brings good out of evil, but David will pay for it, right? And his family will pay, and we'll see that. Okay. All right. So so that's verse 1, right? It's like, there's a, David remained at Jerusalem. That's, not good, right? He's slothful. Verse 2, it happened late one afternoon when David arose from his couch and was walking upon the roof of the king's house. Again, notice, like, his men are off into battle. What's he doing? Taking a nap, right? He's not doing his kingly duty. And not only that, but he's walking on the roof of his house. He has a kind of godlike purview, right? He's out on his roof looking down on his city, right? What's the problem with that, right? Right? What was the temptation of Adam and Eve? You will be like God, right? He's kind of taking a godlike perspective, right? He's taking something to himself that's a prerogative of God. He's taking a godlike view on, it belongs to me and serves me, right? Not good, right? Okay. He was walking upon the roof of the king's house, that he saw from the roof a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful. And David sent and inquired about the woman. And one said, is not this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? So David sent messengers and took her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. Now she was purifying herself from her uncleanness. Then she returned to her house, and the woman conceived, and she sent and told David, I am with child. Okay, so there's a lot here. First, let's just talk about Bathsheba. What does the name Bathsheba mean? Bat or Bath means daughter, okay? And then Sheba comes from Sheva, which is Hebrew for 7. So literally her name means daughter of 7. 7, though, is a very important number, okay? 7 is, because 7 is the number of the days of creation. 7 is the number of the covenant. In fact, so much so that when you swore an oath or a covenant, in Hebrew, you literally say, I seven myself. If you're swearing an oath, you would say, I seven myself. So, and 7 is shorthand for oath or covenant. So you could rightly translate her name, daughter of the oath or daughter of the covenant, okay? Which is interesting, right? In that, like, what is she going to be? She's going to become the mother of Solomon, the heir to the covenant promises. And she's going to become an ancestor of Jesus, right? So really fascinating, right? That her name means, daughter of the covenant, daughter of oath, literally daughter of 7. I 7 myself is to swear an oath in Hebrew. Okay, that's how important the number 7 is. So obviously, David's idleness, his idle curiosity, and looking out onto his city, right, from the roof, from this godlike view from his roof, it leads to lust, which eventually leads to adultery. It's also true that while we have this kind of new, this new fall of Adam, it's also, very easy to see, Eve or Bathsheba is the new Eve, right? She, first of all, she's very comfortably naked in the new garden of the city, maybe too much so, right? Okay. But also, she's also, like, she has become the fruit, right? Like, she's, the fruit was described, right, as good for food and delight to the eyes, right? David sees her and lusts after her, right? So, there's an objectification here, right? Which, by the way, wouldn't have been an issue before the fall, is after the fall. But like here we, but this idea of like what did Adam and Eve, particularly Eve in the garden, like she sees that the fruit is good for food and takes it, right? David sees that Bathsheba is beautiful and takes her, right? There's very intentional here parallels with the fall in Genesis 3. This is a new fall, right? There, this is the new paradise lost, right? This is the, things have been going great in the garden, and now, we're getting another fall in the garden. Okay. Yeah, and like I said, she's like Eve, she's like a little too comfortably naked in the new garden. We don't know to what extent Bathsheba was a willing and culpable participant. I think, like, I'd say traditionally the lean is probably more towards like, I mean, most of the fault's with David, but she knew what she was doing too and went along with it, right? And I would say there's evidence from that. That's probably where I would lean, I think there's a few reasons for that. First, like, she's bathing in plain sight of the palace. It's like, come on, like who's, you know where your bathtub is, right? Like, that you're in view of the palace, like, okay. And also too, there is a detail here. It says she was purifying herself from her uncleanness. What does that mean? Well, if we knew Leviticus, like they would have known backwards and forwards, right? The Torah, her bath is to purify her from normal menstrual uncleanness. So every month, after her menstrual bleeding, Israelite women would have to, 7 days later, they would have to ritually purify themselves, and that's what she's doing. So this bath is not anything abnormal, right? Like, this is something you do every month. You know where you're taking this bath, right, and where you shouldn't be, right? So, and then the other thing too is the Israelite understanding, and this is actually the case with what we know based on modern biology. Their understanding was that a woman was particularly fertile after she'd completed her purification. And if you actually, like, count the days, right? We don't have to get into this, but, like, I know this because of NFP and stuff like that. But like, that's the most fertile. Like, she's not very far from ovulating. So it's possible, we don't know this, but it's possible that this could be a kind of not so subtle advertisement that, like, she's interested in getting pregnant, right? Possible. We don't want to read into the text too far, but, like, that's, it's interesting that they note that detail, that this wasn't just her, like, oh, I was rolling in the mud. Like, this was a particular, like, monthly bath that she would have been doing, and she's in view of the king, right? It also says, we saw in, we don't really need that for now. She also in verse 4, it says David took her. And then a lot of times in the Bible, and we'll see this later on, right? A lot of times when we're talking about, sexual intercourse, often it says that the man came in or into her, right? But notice here it says he took her and she came to him and he laid with her, right? So there does seem to be a little bit of agency on her part, right? And that's normally not how the Bible talks about it. We'll actually see this later, whether it's illicit or not, whether the sexual relation, right? So she came to him. And then I think the other thing too is later, we're not going to read this, but in First Kings, when David is on his deathbed, Bathsheba is actually very assertive and ambitious in that she's not at all passive in, like, getting her son Solomon to the throne. She tells David, "Hey, remember what you promised me, right? You're gonna go through on that promise, right?" And so, like, her character. Now, you could say, like, maybe she's a little more experienced and world-wise at this point, but, like, we do have other evidence that her character, like, she's not passive, and possibly even is trying to position herself so that she becomes the mother of the king, which she eventually does, right? Now, do we know that? Who knows, right? I mean, if you watch the movie with Gregory Peck, right? David and Bathsheba. There's a movie in the golden age of Hollywood, right? She's pretty much a willing, like, she's like, yeah, I'm ambitious and I want this to happen, right? We don't know. The bottom line is the story is just simply not told from her point of view, right? She's, yeah, and as I've pointed out, the Bible is not as concerned. They weren't as concerned in this time about character development in the same way that we are, right? If we write a novel, we want, like, all the internal dialogue of all the characters. The Bible's not interested in that, right? The Bible, this passage is mostly interested in, from David's perspective and David's fall from grace. So, we really don't know how willing of a participant she was. Like I said, I would probably lean towards, like, she knew what she was doing, but, we don't really know. Okay. Also, too, it mentions, for good reason, that, she is the wife of Uriah the Hittite. So he's a Hittite, so he's a Gentile, but he is numbered among David's elite warriors in chapter 23. Okay. His name, Uriah, also means Yahweh is my light. So he has a very Israelite name. Okay. So he's most likely a Gentile convert to Israelite worship, or he's a recent descendant of Gentiles who converted, right? And we're going to see that Uriah, despite his foreign origins, in fact, that he's a foreigner, he's actually a lot more faithful to the Torah than David is, at least in this episode. Okay, so there's part of that playing on, right? Like, he's not obligated to follow the laws of Israel in the same way that David is, yet he does it to the T. Okay, we'll see how that goes out. Okay, so all right, she conceives and she's with child. So now David is pretty swift to action here, right? Okay. So verse 6. So David sent word to Joab, send me Uriah the Hittite. And Joab sent Uriah to David. When Uriah came to him, David asked how Joab was doing, how the people fared, and how the war prospered. So he's making small talk, or not small talk, but he's like, giving a report. Uriah's probably sitting here thinking like, this is pretty non-consequential. Like, what did you call me here for, right? But he's, just, trying to ask about general things so he's not on his trail, right? Then David said to Uriah, go down to your house and wash your feet. And Uriah went out of the king's house, and there followed a present from the king. But Uriah slept at the door of the king's house with all the servants of his lord. He did not go down to his house. So what's going on here? Well, wash your feet is an innuendo. There's different times in the Bible where feet is a euphemism for male genitalia, right? So he's saying like, go wash your feet. Like he's basically saying in no certain terms, like go have a night with your wife. And to make it even more special, right, he sends a present with him. In the present here is probably a portion of food and drink. Okay, so he's sending Uriah back to his house for a romantic. I mean, especially in this time, think about like where you get, the king's table is going to be the best table in the kingdom, right? So he's giving food and wine from his table for Uriah so that he can have a romantic night with his wife, right? They sleep together. Oh, she's pregnant, right? Nobody knows, right, who the father is. Okay, they don't have paternity tests back then, right? Okay. So, like I said, to make this kind of even worse for David, as I said, Uriah is actually more righteous than David. Here, let's see. First of all, let's see, what does he do? Okay, so he slept at the door of the king's house with all his servants of his lord, did not go down to his house. Verse 10. When they told David, Uriah did not go down to his house, David said to Uriah, have you not come from a journey? Why did you not go down to your house? Uriah said to David, the ark and Israel and Judah dwell in booths, and my lord Joab and all the servants of my lord are camping in the open field. Shall I then go to my house to eat and to drink and to lie with my wife? As you live and as your soul lives, I will not do this thing. Then David said to Uriah, remain here today, and tomorrow I will let you depart. So, like I said, Uriah never calls out his king directly, but his righteous following of the law is in very stark contrast to David. So first of all, what's this whole thing about, my boys are out in the field, I was like, well, in this time period, in the law, in the practice of Israel, sexual abstinence was a wartime discipline because it kept the soldiers in a state of ritual purity, right? So that they were like spiritually, morally, like focused on the battle. Also, probably just maybe practically too, it's like they're less distracted, right? They're there for battle, right? It's the time of war, not the time to be home with their wives. And he's not going to relax in his own home because he considers that disloyal to Joab and his fellow soldiers who are out fighting on the battle. Like, am I just going to go home and take a night off when my guys are, out there? And again, who is he unlike? David, right? What was David doing? David was lazy, sleeping on his couch, taking a nap on his couch, right? Uriah's not going to do that. He also references, interestingly, how the ark is in a tent. Presumably they've taken the ark with them, right? Well, what was David really, used to be at least, really concerned about? The fact that the ark was in a tent. He wanted to build a temple for God, and God said, nope, I haven't planned for you to do the temple, right? So Uriah, it's actually possible, arguable. And again, by the way, part of the reason of like the how mysterious it is, right? We don't know exactly. That's actually part of the point, right? It gets you to kind of like, yeah, what is going on, right? What are their motivations? Right? It seems like Uriah might be onto him a little bit, right? We don't know, maybe. But like he knows, right? He said, am I going to go to my house to eat and drink and lie with my wife? He knows, like, why did David send the food, right? He got like I said, that's part of why it's an innuendo. He knew what he was wanting him to do, right? He might even be onto him. We don't know, okay? But he does kind of without directly, maybe he's unwittingly doing it, or he's very wittingly like taking a jab at David, like, I'm doing what you should be doing, right? And again, that whole reference to the ark, that must have stung David, or at least like it's a point of like, you used to be concerned about this kind of stuff too, right? God, where God dwelt and that kind of stuff. Okay. Now, I don't know. I would say probably the evidence that Uriah is unwittingly doing this is what happens next. David is going to send Uriah's kind of death orders with him. So he must trust that Uriah is a good enough guy that he's not going to open the letter. Anyway, so David says, remain here also. Tomorrow I'll let you depart. So now we're at verse 12. So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day and the next. And David invited him. He ate in his presence and drank, so that he made him drunk. And in the evening he went out to lie on his couch with the servants of his Lord, but did not go down to his house. So, okay, David didn't get him to go home to be with his wife. So what's the next plan? Get him drunk, and then maybe he'll go. Maybe then he'll go, right? He gets him drunk, but even still, even drunk Uriah still stays faithful, right? And doesn't go down to be with his wife, right? And so, that plan doesn't work, okay? Verse 14. In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of Uriah. This is what I said. This would probably be the best evidence of, like, maybe Uriah is unwittingly insulting David. Like, he really doesn't know. Because David trusts that, like, hey, this guy is a follower of the law, and certainly something that would be very much against the law would be opening the king's mail, right? So David said, but there is a really, like, macabre and dreadfully ironic, like, twist here. I mean, how cruel it is, right? That David sends this guy's own, like, death warrant basically with himself, right? Like, how terrible is that? Okay. He's taking advantage of Uriah's goodness, right? In a terrible way. Okay, so in the letter, verse 15, in the letter he wrote, set Uriah in the forefront of the hardest fighting, and then draw back from him, that he may be struck down and die. And as Joab was besieging the city, by the way, what's the city? Oh, here, it disappeared. Remember the backdrop of this. The city is Rabbah. That's the city that they're besieging, okay? And as Joab was besieging this city, he assigned Uriah to the place where he knew there were valiant men. And the men of the city came out and fought with Joab, and some of the servants of David among the people fell. Uriah the Hittite was slain also. Then Joab sent and told David all the news about the fighting, and he instructed the messenger, when you have finished telling all the news about the fighting to the king, then if the king's anger rises, and if he says to you, why did you go so near the city to fight? Did you not know that they would shoot from the wall? Who killed Abimelech, the son of Jerubasheth? Did not a woman cast an upper millstone upon him from the wall so that he died at Thebez? Why did you go so near the wall? Then you shall also say, your servant Uriah the Hittite is also dead. There's a few things here that are kind of interesting. First of all, it seems as if Joab used a inferior military strategy to carry out the king's orders. Not only does he, like, send Uriah, to kill off Uriah, but he also sends a bunch of other men, probably to cover up that he's trying to get Uriah killed. So here we have, like, the cascading effects of David's sin, right? It's not just that Uriah dies. Joab sends other guys to kind of cover so that it's not obvious that Uriah is getting cut down, right? So Joab is sending this messenger, and the news is bad, right? They had a bad defeat because they lost some really good men, not just Uriah. Notice also, remember, and this is kind of a motif of this Samuel literature, David hasn't always taken bad news well, right? Or if he, remember, like, the guy who came and said, hey, I killed Saul, right? And David's like, you shouldn't have done that, and cuts him down, right? Like, David is known, right, to get kind of upset and take swift action at bad news, right? So then Joab tells the messenger this little kind of story, but the story is really kind of interesting. This isn't from the book of Judges, so if we had read the book of Judges, we'd know this, right? Abimelech was a son of Gideon. So Jerubasheth is another name for Gideon, okay? Gideon was the guy who, he was one of the judges, okay? Well, Abimelech, he aspired to be king after, Gideon was the leader. Abimelech wanted to be king, but he got too close to the city wall of Thebez, and he got too close, and a woman threw a rock and hit him in the head, And as he was lying there dying, he told his armor bearer, run me through so that I don't die at the hands of a woman, because that's like extremely shameful, right, in this time period. Okay. Now, it's interesting that Joab, like, this is all, Joab is just bringing in this story, right? He's kind of made this made up kind of dialogue of like, hey, if he says this, tell me, first of all, because David's not the one who references this story. It's Joab is referencing this story in this hypothetical David, because that story is, first of all, right, it's a a warning, like, don't fight too close to the wall, right? Like, what were you guys doing? Didn't you remember, like, Abimelech, what happened to him? But it's also interesting, right, that, like, what is part of that story, right? He dies partly by the hand of a woman, right? Like, I don't know. Is Joab kind of know something's going on, right? Like, he's got these orders from David to kill this guy Uriah the Hittite. Who knows, right? It's just kind of interesting little detail that Joab kind of brings out this story from the blue that involves a woman in the downfall of a man, right? Who knows, right? Okay, so anyway, what does David say? So the messenger went and came and told David all that Joab had sent him to tell. The messenger said to David, the men gained an advantage over us and came out against us in the field, but we drove them back to the entrance of the gate. Then the archers shot at your servants from the wall. Some of the king's servants are dead, and your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also. So there's what happened in the battle, right? They pushed them back into the city gates, but went too close to the gates, too close to the walls. Like, well, that's a terrible military strategy. Joab knows better than that, right? But what was he doing? He was carrying out the king's orders, right? And not only did Uriah die, but a bunch of other guys died too, right? Okay. What's David's response? David said to the messenger, thus shall you say to Joab, do not let this matter trouble you, for the sword devours now one and now another. Strengthen your attack upon the city and overthrow it, and encourage him. Like, he has this kind of indifference, right? How cruel, right? It's like, oh yeah, like, it happens. No, this doesn't just happen, right? Like, normally it would be like, what were you doing, right? Being so stupid, right? We lost a lot of good men. But again, David has a cruel unconcern for the lost battle and for the lost men, right? This is just going from bad to worse, okay? Verse 26, when the wife of Uriah heard that Uriah, her husband, was dead, she made lamentation for her husband. And when the mourning was over, David sent and brought her to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. So, it's pretty clear David wastes no time in bringing her into his house. Guess how long the period of lamentation was? 7 days. So after 7 days, she's in his house, right? Now, again, why do they need to do this? Well, because we need to cover for the pregnancy, right? Just for reference, in Hamlet, the great play by Shakespeare, he's disturbed that his mother, married his uncle, right? That was 2 months, right? Like, Hamlet, you got nothing on, or your mom has nothing on Bathsheba, right? Is after 7 days, she's in David's house, right? Now, we've kind of pointed out, like, I don't know how, we don't really know, like, how secretive was this really, who knows? I mean, it seemed on one hand, David might have gotten away with the perfect crime here, right? Nobody's the wiser, right? Nobody knows. Because what does Joab know? He just, hey, I was, carrying out the king's work. We lost a tough battle, right? Now, again, there's some evidence, maybe, based on Uriah's response, based on Joab's kind of response. It might be that, and plus, like, we're getting around a little bit. Like, maybe David didn't get away with this as clean as he should. That's not really that's not really what matters, though. What's the last line, right? The thing that David had done displeased the Lord. Literally what it says in the original is it was evil in the eyes of the Lord. That's what matters, right? Regardless of how much of a perfect crime it was, and it may not have been, but a king has absolute unchecked power, even if his soldiers and Joab and all the characters involved, even if they're kind of like, this is kind of fishy, right? They can't do anything about it, right? But what's the problem? David has displeased the Lord, right? And God knows, right? nothing can escape God's glance, right? And that's not a threat. It's just God is God, right? We can't hide our crimes from God. It's not that God's like, I'm gonna, get him or whatever. No, it's God is God. He's omniscient, meaning he knows everything into being. It's not that he finds out about stuff. It's that he knows everything intimately from the beginning of time, and nothing escapes his gaze. So God sees that what David did was evil, and that's what matters. And that's the problem. That's the biggest problem. Okay, so what's going to happen? Chapter 12. And the Lord sent Nathan to David. We've heard about Nathan before. He's a prophet, right? And there will be court prophets. Some of them are bad because they just tell the king what he wants to hear. But here we see Nathan is the prophet of God, the mouthpiece of God, and Nathan shows a lot of courage because one of the, he's commissioned by God to do this, but he speaks truth to power, right? That's part of the job of the prophet, to speak truth to power. And Nathan, and you'll notice here, Nathan carries himself with an authority and a confidence that is like, this is what God has told me, and this is how it is, right? And David has to answer to not Nathan, but to God, who Nathan represents, right? So the Lord sent Nathan to David. He came to him and said to him, there were two men in a certain city, the one rich and the other poor. The rich man had very many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing but one little ewe lamb, which he had bought. And he brought it up, and it grew up with him and with his children. It used to eat of his morsel and drink from his cup and lie in his bosom, and it was like a daughter to him. Now there came a traveler to the rich man, and he was unwilling to take one of his own flock or herd to prepare for the wayfarer who had come to him. But he took the poor man's lamb and prepared it for the man who had come to him. So Nathan tells this little parable, right? And David thinks that it's an actual court case, which is not odd. David, in part of his role as the king, is the Supreme Court, right? So certain court cases would make its way up to David, and he's the judge, right? So he takes it literally, but there's interesting, there's a few details in here, right? Notice the verbs, right? That this ewe lamb, it used to eat of his morsel, it used to drink from his cup and lie in his bosom, right? What did David do with Bathsheba? He ate and drank, presumably, and lied with her. And then what did Uriah refuse to do? He refused to eat and to drink and to lie with his wife, right? So, within this little parable, Nathan is kind of weaving in, it's about David, right? It's about this situation, right? Also too, the lying in his bosom, there is a kind of sexual connotation there, right? And also too, then it says it was like a daughter to him. Remember what the first part of Bathsheba means? Bat or bath means daughter, right? So it's not just again, he's painting this picture, and there's these little details in there about what am I really referring to here? So and then also too, in the narrative and in the parable, in the narrative and in the Garden of Eden, right? What does the rich man do? He takes the poor man. He took the poor man's lamb, right? So remember, go back all the way to Genesis. Adam and Eve take the apple. In the narrative, David took Bathsheba. In this little parable, the rich man takes the lamb, right? Again, that same parallel language here. Okay. So what is David's reaction? Then David's anger, verse 5, was greatly kindled against the man. And he said to Nathan, as the Lord lives, which is the language of an oath, right? Okay. The man who has done this deserves to die, and he shall restore the lamb fourfold, because he did this thing, and because he had no pity. So David takes it literally, right? Or takes this as a real court case, and he pronounces judgment. He becomes very angry and condemns himself unknowingly, right? It's also interesting. So he says, what's the restitution? Fourfold, which is from the Torah, from Exodus. If a thief stole a sheep, he had to repay it fourfold. Okay, so David knows the Torah. He's following. That's the restitution, right? It's interesting, though, that he also says, though, because David understands that this isn't just about thievery, right? This is about this man had no pity, right? And so he deserves to die. He doesn't say that he will die, right? But he says he deserves to die. It's ironic because capital punishment is not the punishment for thievery in Exodus, in the Torah, right? Capital punishment is the punishment for adultery and for murder, right? It's kind of interesting, right? You know, that like ironically, he says he deserves to die, and it's like, yeah, you're right, he does actually. Like the Torah says, you know, very clearly that if a man and a woman commit adultery, they both die. If a man commits murder, he dies, right? Okay. Anyway, okay, and then, right, and this is probably one of the best like mic drop moments in all the Bible, right? Nathan says to David, "You are the man," right? I mean, like, you know, imagine like you probably could have heard a pin drop, right? You know, just like, oh, like, you know, and then notice, right? I mean, you just like, you know, also though, I do think here, you know, there's this is not in the notes. This is something I thought of actually. I think there's an echo here of ecce homo, right? Behold the man, right? Which is Pilate. What Pilate says to Jesus, right, when he's being condemned. Behold the man. It's called ecce homo in Latin. Jesus, not because he's sinful like David, right? But so what is the moment, right? Especially you see this in the Passion of the Christ. Jesus, the ecce homo, the moment is when he's been beaten and scourged and he's clothed in a royal robe with a crown of thorns. And Pilate says in Latin, ecce homo, behold the man, right? Here is the man. And what is Jesus? He has not sinned, but he's taken upon himself the sins of the world, right? He was scourged for our transgressions, right? So I do think there's a parallel here. I don't know, maybe not, but you know, like David, you know, Nathan's like, you are the man. Jesus is like, I've become the man, not because I'm guilty, but to take away the guilt of others, right? So anyway, something there, I think. So Nathan says to David, you are the man. Then notice like now Nathan is just like, you know, he sprung the trap, and he's like, now Nathan's going to tell him on behalf of God, here's what's going to happen, right? Okay. All right, here's your here's the deal. You are the man. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel. I anointed you king over Israel, and I delivered you out of the hand of Saul, and I gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your bosom, and gave you the house of Israel and of Judah. And if this were too little, I would add to you as much more. So the first thing he does, right, is he reiterates to David all the blessings God does, all the blessings that he's given him, right? Again, has David accomplished these things, or has God accomplished these things? Yes and yes, but who has the more priority? God does. And both things are true. Same is true with our lives, right? Lord, you have accomplished all that we have done. Have you done great things in your life? The good thing, you know, think of the thing that you're most proud of, or that, not in a good sense, right? The thing that you're like, I've accomplished. Have you done it? Yes. Has God done it? Yes. But that's because God's relationship to you is not the same as like an outside person's relationship, right? He works within and through you. Because like, let's say, you know, I don't know, what's an accomplishment that someone's done, right? You raised a family, or you had a good job or something, right? You know, it's like, well, who gave you the ability for your job? God did, right? And not just that he like set you on your way, but he's actually been working through you, right? So notice like, and hopefully this whole narrative of 2 Samuel has kind of helped us see that principle, right? That like God is not in competition with us, right? That like what we do, the good things that we do, all credit goes to God, not because he does it and we don't, but because he and we do it on different planes, different ontological levels, we would say, right? If you want to use a more philosophical term, okay? So God is saying, like, I gave you all these gifts and all these things, right? The reference, by the way, where he says, I lost my place here, but when he says that, I gave you your master's wives, it was common in this time, right, that like the successor king would take over the harem of the previous king, right? So like, and then what does God say? And if this were too little, I would have given you more, right? Like, I wanted to continue to bless you and bless you and bless you. Also notice too, there is a parallel here to, remember after God promised David a house, and then David had that really beautiful hymn of like outbursts of prayer and thanksgiving in chapter 7, where he said, and he listed all the things that God had done for him and thanksgiving. Here we have like a reversal of that, right? But instead of David in that previous posture he had of humility and thanksgiving to God, God is telling David, like, I did all these things for you. And then what does he say next? Verse 9, why then have you despised the word of the Lord to do what is evil in his sight? You have struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword, and have taken his wife to be your wife, and have slain him with the sword of the Ammonites. Now therefore the sword shall never depart from your house, because you have despised me, and have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. So basically, like, so now after listing all the things that God has done for him, now God is going to, he first of all, he reveals the crime, right? Like, Nathan presumably didn't know about any of this except for God telling him, right? And then the punishment fits the crime. God's punishments are not so much like arbitrariness, or God's just like, sin is its own punishment. Dante is really clever about this in the Divine Comedy, right? Like, the punishments in the Divine Comedy fit the crime, right? So, for example, like, the schismatics are sliced up and down, right? Because they split the body of Christ, so their bodies are split, right? Or those who, the lustful, right, are blown about in a treacherous windstorm. They couldn't say no to their passions, so now they're blown about in a violent windstorm for the rest of eternity, right? The punishment fits the crime. But even in this life, we see that principle, right? That, it's not punishments. The punishment of sin is not God just like, broke the rule. Okay, I guess I'll do this to you, right? No, it's like our sin is its own, like, has its own consequences. So David, what did David do, right? He cut down Uriah with the sword. So now God says, therefore, and this line is probably like the characteristic of the rest of this book and the rest of David's life, is now the sword shall never depart from your house. Why? Because violence begets violence. David uses the sword against Uriah. We're going to have violence the rest of this book, right? And it's going to come from where? David's own house. Okay, we're going to see that here. It's going to be civil war. Okay. So verse 11, that's where we were. Thus says the Lord, behold, I will raise up evil against you out of your own house, and I will take your wives before your eyes, and give them to your neighbor, and he shall lie with your wives in the sight of this sun. For you did it secretly, but I will do this thing before all Israel and before the sun. Again, just like how violence begets violence, sexual immorality begets sexual immorality. Okay, not to spoil it, but like, what's going to happen is, this is what's going to happen. David's own son, Absalom, is going to rebel against him. And what's this referring to is Absalom, in a horrific act of usurpation, is going to set up a tent on top of the palace and take David's concubines, and in the sight of all the people of Israel, say, screw you, Dad, and he's going to sleep with his father's concubines, right? You did this in secret. This is going to be brought out. Again, this isn't God being arbitrary, or like, this isn't like, it's like, like, sin has consequences. What we're going to see here very shortly, David's sons are going to start to act like dad. And it gets really ugly, right? We'll see that later. Anyway, David said, so there's, David tried to take Bathsheba in secret. Absalom is going to take David's concubines in the sight of all Israel. That's what's eventually going to happen, okay? So what's the lesson, right? Suffering is the painful consequence for spurning the Lord's commands. Same thing. Remember, this is, I've been setting this up partly as like this is a retelling of Genesis 3, the story of the fall, right? Adam and Eve, same thing, right? Their punishments, it's not God just like arbitrarily like, you know what? I think I'm going to create like weeds, and you're going to have to now like till the soil, no, the point is like before the fall, the work in the garden came very easy to you. Now it's going to be really difficult. By the sweat of your brow, you'll get produce out of the earth, right? Childbearing, right? It's not like God was just like, it'd be really fun is if I just like ramp up the pain, No, okay? like what would have come easy before the fall, bearing children, now is going to be painful. And yes, I think the physical is part of it, but I think even more so spiritually, right? I mean, what's much worse than labor pain? Watching your child suffer and die, and you can't do anything about it, right? But guess what, Adam and Eve? That's the world that now exists because of your sin, right? In pain will you bring forth children, right? Again, it's not God being arbitrary, But here's the good news, right? God's punishments are also always blessings because they're meant to be like rehabilitating in the best sense, that like God is teaching Adam and Eve that like some things are worth suffering for out of love, right? That like it's better to say, yeah, it's better to do the work of toil and come up fruitless than to just not do the work, right? Or it's better to go through the pain of bearing and raising children and to say yes to life than to just say no to life, right? And ultimately, where does God demonstrate this, right? God suffers for love on the cross, right? Because he had to go through the suffering of the cross in order for us to have life. So his punishments are also teaching us, rehabilitating us. And that's part of, David now. Yes, for the rest of his life, the sword will not depart from his house. But we're going to see David is a much more humble man because he's been broken, right? We saw through chapter 10 how David was kind of moving from triumph to triumph to triumph. And that's part of what led, like he couldn't handle the success, right? He was losing his soul, right? He was lazy, and that led to lust, and that led to adultery, and that led to murder. He's going to be a lot more broken now, right? But humble. And therefore, and remember at the beginning of this book, I told you, like, and this is part of the mystery that we have to wrestle with this book, is what's the difference between David and Saul, right? Because Saul did a lot of wicked things too. And in some ways, Saul didn't seem to do his worst things, right? Like Saul, made a bad sacrifice and didn't destroy the king of Amalek like he was supposed to. But what's the difference? David is repentant, and he's sorry and contrite, and he's broken. And because he's broken and humble, God can work with that. God can't work with Saul because Saul is proud and stubborn and hard-hearted, right? And we're going to see a much more broken David for the rest of this book, okay? So what is David's response, right? Verse 13, and notice right away, and this is important, right? David, because David's the king. He's the most powerful guy in the kingdom, right? What is David? Verse 13, David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. He doesn't make excuses, right? He doesn't say, well, yeah, but, no, he says, I have sinned against the Lord. And Nathan said to David, the Lord has put away your sin. You shall not die. What a relief that would have been to hear from David. Because David knows, by the way, when he says, I have sinned against the Lord, he knows what the punishment for adultery and murder is. It's death. But God has mercy on David, and he gives him a second chance, right? David could have been rightly condemned to death, and David knows this. So when Nathan says to David, the Lord has put away your sin, you shall not die, okay, like God is being merciful, right? Because the strict sense of the Torah, right? Now, God can do that, right? God is not, bound by the law. He has mercy on David. Nevertheless, because by this deed you have utterly scorned the Lord, the child that is born to you shall die. Then Nathan went to his house. Okay, so part of what we got going on here is, and this is an important concept, and that because Protestants will ask us about like purgatory all the time. Nathan is implicitly making a distinction here, which the church makes between the guilt of sin and the temporal punishment due to sin. There's the guilt of sin that we need to be all forgiven of, and there's the effects of sin that we still have to deal with, right? David is forgiven by the Lord. His guilt is remitted. And not only that, but the Lord has mercy on him and does not give him the punishment that he deserves, which is death, according to the Torah. However, David still has to deal with the effects and the consequences of his sin, starting with the death of the child, right? And then we're going to see more and more of that, okay? Before we get into, and I'll talk a little bit more about, okay, the death of the child. That's, sounds a little cruel, right? But before we get into that, okay, I do want to read, just because it's worth reading. So if you go to Psalm 51, like, we say, how do we know? How do we know that David is not just, how do we know that he's sincere? Okay. Is David just, just telling God, like, yeah, I'm sorry, how do we know he's sincere? Well, partly we know he's sincere because of this Psalm, okay? Psalm 51, yeah. This Psalm is one of, if not the most beautiful penitential Psalms that there is. And if you find yourself in the midst of any kind of sin, right, like this, or the midst of sorrow for your sins, right, this Psalm is, it's just very beautiful. St. John Vianney, I read once that he was like, it was almost worth it that David sinned for this Psalm. Not quite, but like, David, who was a very talented hymnist and singer, right, as we've seen, one of the good things that God brings out of this evil deed is this Psalm. And priests and religious pray this Psalm every single Friday morning in the Liturgy of the Hours. We pray Psalm 51 and it is, it's a beautiful Psalm. So it's worth reading. You'll see that in this Psalm, it says right there, to the choir master, a Psalm of David, when Nathan the prophet came to him after he had gone into Bathsheba. So it's like, well, okay, pretty clear why he wrote this one, right? Okay. And then what does he say? And this is the Psalm. I'll just read it through. Have mercy on me, O God, according to your merciful love. According to your abundant mercy, blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. For I know my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me. Against you alone have I sinned, and done that which is evil in your sight, so that you are justified in your sentence and blameless in your judgment. Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me. Behold, you desire truth in the inward being. Therefore teach me wisdom in my secret heart. Purge me with the hyssop, and I shall be clean. Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow. Make me hear joy and gladness. Let the bones which you have broken rejoice. Hide your face from my sins, and blot out all my iniquities. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and put a new and right spirit within me. Cast me not away from your presence, and take not your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation, and uphold me with a willing spirit. Then I will teach transgressors your ways, and sinners will return to you. Deliver me from blood guilt, O God of my salvation, and my tongue will sing aloud of your deliverance. O Lord, open my lips, and my mouth shall show forth your praise. For you take no delight in sacrifice. Were I to give a burnt offering, you would not be pleased. The sacrifice acceptable to God is a broken spirit. A broken and contrite heart, O God, you will not despise. Do good to Zion in your good pleasure. Rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. Then you will delight in right sacrifices, in burnt offerings and whole burnt offerings. Then bulls will be offered on your altar. Isn't that really beautiful? And it also gives us a very rich, words and attitude and dispositions of how we approach God when we're approaching him sorry for our sins, right? There's a lot there, but I mean there's a lot of beautiful things there, but if you're feeling weighed down and overwhelmed by my sins and before or after you go to confession, right? I need to order some more of those because I'll give those out as penances, right? To pray Psalm 51. Imagine, after all that's transpired, that was David's attitude, right? And he recognizes, what does he recognize? I need help. I need God. I can't do it. Lord, you have to wash me from my sins, right? And what's the only thing that David can offer him? a broken, contrite heart, right? So anyway, I just want to, that's worth reading just because it's, there's a lot there, but that psalm goes back to this episode, and David composed it after, and has obviously put his talent to great use, and we still use that every Friday, and even more so in the liturgy, so yeah. Arguably the greatest penitential psalm that there is. Okay, anyway, back to the narrative. Okay, so verse 15. And the Lord struck the child that Uriah's wife bore to David, and it became sick. David therefore besought God for the child, and David fasted and went in and lay all night upon the ground. Notice, that's what Uriah did, laid on the ground, right? And that when he didn't go home, right? And the elders of his house stood beside him to raise him from the ground, but he would not, nor did he eat food with them. On the 7th day the child died, and the servants of David feared to tell him that the child was dead, for they said, Behold, while the child was yet alive, we spoke to him, and he did not listen to us. How then can we say to him that the child is dead? He may do himself some harm. Part of why they're confused is because normally you would mourn for death after the death. So they're thinking, like, if he was like mourning and fasting for 7 days and was distraught before, what is he going to do now? He's going to harm himself or us, right? But when David saw that his servants were whispering together, David perceived that the child was dead. Then David said to his servants, Is the child dead? They said, He is dead. Then David arose from the earth and washed and anointed himself and changed his clothes, and he went into the house of the Lord and worshipped. He then went to his own house, and when he asked, they set food before him, and he ate. Then his servants said to him, What is this thing that you have done? You fasted and wept for the child while it was alive, but when the child died, you arose and ate food. He said, While the child was still alive, I fasted and wept, for I said, Who knows whether the Lord will be gracious to me, that the child may live? But now he is dead. Why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I shall go to him, but he shall not return to me. Okay, so a few things here. First of all, so yes, why is it that the child dies and not David? Part of it is like, well, with all life, God is the master of life and death, right? So when God calls the life of someone back, right, it's not like God is, murdering or anything like that. It's not like, it's like God is the master of life and death. God knows in his purposes, what is good and what is not according to his part, right? And so, and part of it is too, right? David recognizes that this is a this is a consequence of the sin, right? Like this child was brought about by an illicit union, right? That it doesn't belong to him in a certain sense, right? There's a kind of way in which it's like this child belongs to God, right? Not to David. And the child it's a kind of restitution, right? Now, and so David, again, so it's not that God is being particularly cruel to the child. It's the child's life belongs to me, right? And you are going to have to trust David that I'm taking care of this child, right? I mean, we know God is a good and merciful God. Obviously, he's not going to, torture the child or anything like that. But it's like the child's life belongs to me, and you need to give him back to me. So there is a sense here in which David is, again, humbled. He's placed in the position of Job, right? I can't understand all your purposes, God. I just have to trust that you know what's best. That's also why, right? David, notice he has the part of what God is doing, right, is teaching David the correct attitude that he should have in prayer, right? David doesn't whine and complain that well, God, you didn't listen to me. That's not why we pray, right? We pray to align our wills with God. And then when things don't always work out our way, we trust God, you know what you're doing. You know what you're about. I know that you'll take care of this child, and it's for the best, right? Even if it's not exactly what I would have wanted, okay? It is also notable, right, that the child dies on the 7th day, because what would happen on the 8th day? Circumcision, right? Being part of the covenant family of people, right? So again, I don't think we should particularly worry about the child. God is taking care of the child, but it's part of what you owe to me, David, is the life of this child, right? It belongs to me. So again, after the child dies, David cleans up and worships God, showing that his resignation to the will of God, even in the midst of his grief. Already we see here some moral progress, right, of David, right? That he's approaching God rightly again. It's like, okay, God, I trust you. And then that kind of line at the end there, right? I shall go to him, but he will not return to me. What's he referring to there? Sheol in Hades, in Hebrew, or Hades in Greek, right? That, like, he's not going to come back to me, but I will go to him. Although I think there's too also kind of a little hint here, right? Of like, maybe not a hint, but like there's a, like the the resurrection, right? Like, what is God going to do with his son? Rise him from the dead. And what is he going to do? Take David and presumably this child, who's also never named, by the way. This David and this child, David will go to Sheol, to Hades, to be with this child. But eventually, right, Jesus, David's son, will come and will take David and this child, right? Does God reveal all that to David right now? No. But David needs to trust that God knows what he's doing. And yeah, I would presume that this child was freed with all the other captives when Jesus came, right? To reverse the curse of that David was part of. So anyway, there's kind of stuff there. All right, and then verse 24. Then David comforted his wife Bathsheba and went into her and lay with her, and she bore a son, and he called his name Solomon. And the Lord loved him and sent a message by Nathan the prophet, so that he called his name Jedediah because of the Lord. So for one thing that's notable, this is the first time in the narrative that Bathsheba is referred to as David's wife. Okay, that's important, right? It's also, there's a few instances in the Old Testament where sexual intimacy between husband and wife is shown as a source of comfort and healing during a time of grief, and it can have that function, right? Particularly like after the fall, Adam and Eve have sexual intimacy, and it's kind of like, that's not the original intention of it, right? But after the fall, in a time of grief, like, it is a way to kind of bring kind of healing, right? And then Adam and Eve are able to have children, right? Or they have children through that, right? Also, after the other instance in Genesis where this comes to mind is Isaac. Isaac loses his mother Sarah, and he's grieving, and it says that he was comforted by his wife, right? So there's a sense here, I think, in which, David and Bathsheba, now they're broken people, right? But part of what helps them move on, right, is now coming together, but legitimately as husband and wife now, okay? And again, this is a great example where even out of evil, God brings good, right? Solomon, what does the name Solomon mean? Well, it's related to the Hebrew word shalom, which means peace. Solomon, unlike his father, is not going to be on the campaign war trail because the borders have all been secured, more or less, right? Solomon will reign in a relative peacetime, the greatest peacetime in Israel's history. And what does this peace allow him to do? Build the temple, right? So that's important. And then also too, it's interesting. It says the Lord loved him and sent a message. The Lord tells Nathan to name him Jedediah, to give him this additional name. Jedediah means beloved of the Lord. What's going on here? Well, part of it is fulfillment of the covenant that God made to David. Remember, God said, your son will be a son to me, right? And I will love him, right? So it's fulfilling the covenant to David, okay? It's also showing God's mercy, right? As he said, he's not giving up on David or David's line. Also, too, God's love is the basis for God's election throughout the Old Testament, throughout the New Testament, and even today. God loves Solomon, and therefore he's chosen Solomon to build him his temple. Later, this is my beloved son, right, with whom I am well pleased. God, before Jesus has done anything in his mission, God says, I love him, right? That's more fundamental. God loves him. Same with us, right? God's love for us is then the source of our mission, right? That God first, loves us and then chooses us because of his love for us. So that's part of what's going on here too. Also, I think, there's an echo here of St. John, right? What does St. John refer to himself as? The beloved disciple, right? Why? Because, that's how he sees himself in light of the Lord's love. And that's the relationship that the Lord is going to have with Solomon, right? Okay, and then to wrap up chapter 12, so, back to the kind of bigger picture, right? The Ammonites, we still are besieging Ammon, okay? 26. Now Joab fought against Rabbah of the Ammonites and took the royal city. So again, it's here, Ammon. Maybe it was slowed down too by the fact that he lost some of those great men, some of those good men, right? Because of David's order. And Joab sent messengers to David and said, I have fought against Rabbah. Moreover, I have taken the city of waters. Now then, gather the rest of the people together and encamp against the city and take it, lest I take the city and it be called by my name. Kind of interesting here. I mean, Joab's an interesting figure, right? It's like sometimes he's like kind of undermines David. Sometimes he's like super loyal to him at the same time. Basically, David or Joab is saying, hey, maybe he's warning David, but what he's essentially saying here is, hey, if I take this city, people are going to give me the credit, and we could have an insurrection on our hands. Or maybe it's a little bit of a passive threat, but like, hey, like if you don't get off your butt and come like do this, right? Like, I'm going to get credit, and maybe this city will be mine, right? Who knows? Either way, though, he's like, David, yeah, like better come out here. Verse 29, so David gathered all the people together and went to Rabbah and fought against it and took it. And he took the crown of their king from his head. The weight of it was a talent of gold, and in it was a precious stone, and it was placed on David's head. By the way, a talent of gold estimated at 75 pounds. So it's also possible that a crown of this size and weight rested on top of their idol, right? So David is decrowning the idol is another possibility here. The weight of it was a talent of gold, and in it was a precious stone, and it was placed on David's head. And he brought forth the spoil of the city, a very great amount. And he brought forth the people who were in it, and set them to labor with saws and iron picks and iron axes, and made them toil at the brick kilns. And thus he did to all the cities of the Ammonites. Then David and all the people returned to Jerusalem. So here we see, after this, episode of his misdeeds, to say the least, here we kind of have a last like flash of the old glorious David, right? He does get off his butt. He goes out and he, takes the Ammonites, takes them over, and this is the last time we see that. So in one sense, it's like, well, I guess there's some moral progress in that he's like doing what he should have been doing at the beginning of chapter 11, but it is a little bit of kind of a flickering flash of the old David, right? We don't really see this again. Again, maybe just from a practical standpoint, he's getting older, but it's showing like, yeah, he's declining, right? And it's, yeah, this is kind of his last triumph. It's just going to get worse from here, right? And notice too, right? Maybe David, he's been told by Nathan the prophet that like, I'm going to bring the sword will come from your own house. Remember, Joab is his nephew, right? So maybe it's possible, we don't know, but maybe it's possible that David is a little bit on high alert, right? He gets up and goes and takes care of business because he's like, is Joab going to rebel against me, right? Little does he know it's going to be much worse than that, right? It's not going to be Joab. It's not going to be his nephew. It's going to be his son. Okay. All right. That's all the time we have for today. Yeah, it gets pretty dark after here, so yeah, buckle up. But like I said, what we're gonna see happen is, again, like, David has sinned, and we're seeing, the wages of sin, like sin is its own punishment, right? We're seeing the consequence of sin, and a lot of it actually is really, as I said, and we're gonna see this. We go right into chapter 13. We're going to talk about David's two sons, his oldest Amnon and his third oldest Absalom. And basically, like, Amnon and Absalom are going to start to act like dad, but worse, right? And David's ineptitude is going to be on full display, right? And it's not good. Yeah. So, again, we had this whole, like, again, it's sad, right? It's a tragedy, right? It's a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions, right? Because here we have the greatest, no, remember, this is the greatest king in the history of Israel, right? And it was just, the whole first part of the book was just one victory to another, right? It just was getting better and better. We're creating a new Eden, the new kingdom of God on earth, the new, garden. But what happened, right? David was supposed to guard and protect the garden, which is what Adam was supposed to do. What does he do? He gives in to temptation, he commits sin, and now, it's like, in a lot of ways, it's worse than when we started, and it's going to lead to all kinds of, horrible things. Civil war, they say, is the worst kind of war, right? Because it's brother against brother, it's people against people, right? Your own people. And so it is like, it's kind of, but it's like, again, what's the whole point? It's like, well, welcome to the world, right? Welcome to the world we find ourselves in. And hopefully, like, the interesting thing about this narrative, right, is the Old Testament is open-ended, right? There's no definitive solution to the Old Testament of, like, how is God going to fix this, and how is he going to follow through on all his promises, right? And that's where, like, enter in the New Testament and Jesus, who fulfills all these things in spades, but goes beyond what we could have imagined, right? He doesn't just set up a nice kingdom in modern day Palestine. He goes way beyond that, right? The kingdom of heaven, right? That can't be overthrown, or there where no tear, right? All that kind of stuff, right? So Jesus fulfills the David, but you can see how, like, people in Jesus' time, when they think like new son of David, they're probably thinking like, hey, let's go back to 2 Samuel chapter 10, where everything was really great, So